Jerome only wanted to celebrate his anniversary in peace. But when he's humiliated in public, a hidden family secret changes everything. The sun was barely rising over the quiet suburban neighborhood of Willow Creek, casting a soft glow over the manicured lawns and pristine houses. It was the kind of neighborhood where every hedge was perfectly trimmed, and every car in the driveway sparkled under the morning light. But beneath the surface, not everything was as perfect as it seemed. Across the street from each other lived two families who had never exchanged more than polite hellos, until now. On one side was Linda Hawkins, a wealthy white woman in her mid-50s. Linda had moved into the neighborhood nearly 20 years ago, back when her husband still owned a successful real estate business. She had always carried herself with a sense of superiority, the kind of person who judged others by their appearance and status. Her house was the largest on the block, with its sprawling gardens and luxury vehicles parked in the driveway. Linda had been raised to believe that wealth equated to worth, and she never questioned it. On the other side of the street was Jerome Williams, a quiet man in his early 40s, who had moved into the neighborhood with his two children, Malik and Tara, just a few years ago. Jerome was a single father, working 2 jobs to make ends meet. He wasn't flashy, and his house wasn't the biggest, but it was filled with warmth and love. His kids adored him, and the neighbors often saw them playing basketball in the driveway or riding their bikes together down the quiet streets. Despite Jerome's friendly demeanor, Linda barely acknowledged him. Her perception clouded by prejudices she refused to admit to herself. That morning, as Linda stood sipping her coffee in her pristine kitchen, she glanced out the window to check on her precious BMW, which she always kept spotless. Her heart stopped. The car was gone. She set her cup down, her mind racing, and without hesitation, she picked up the phone. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm, but Linda's was shaking. My car is missing, she nearly screamed, her breath coming out in frantic bursts. It's been stolen. The operator tried to calm her down, asking for details, but Linda's mind was already jumping to conclusions. She glanced out the window again, her eyes locking on Jerome's house. She had seen him outside late the night before, and in her panic state, she made a quick assumption that he, or someone connected to him, must be involved. When the police arrived, 2 patrol cars pulled up with flashing lights, and neighbors began peeking through their blinds. Jerome, who was inside preparing breakfast for his kids, heard the commotion and stepped outside, confused by the scene unfolding in front of him. Linda, still in her robe and slippers, rushed out of her house, her face red with fury. She didn't even bother with pleasantries as she marched over to Jerome's driveway, where 2 officers were standing. There he is, she pointed a shaking finger at Jerome. That man has been eyeing my car for weeks. I know it. He must have taken it. Jerome's face fell in shock. What? I didn't. But Linda cut him off, her voice growing louder. You're always out here late at night. I've seen you. You probably took it when everyone was sleeping. Jerome felt his stomach twist. He had no idea where her car was, but the weight of her accusation hit him like a ton of bricks. His mind raced as he tried to comprehend what was happening. One of the officers, a tall, middle-aged man named Officer Davis, held up his hand, signaling for both of them to calm down. Ma'am, he addressed Linda first. We're going to look into this, but please let us handle it. Linda crossed her arms, glaring at Jerome, her words dripping with disdain. I want my car back, she spat, as if Jerome had hidden it in his garage. Officer Davis turned to Jerome, his voice more measured. Sir, can we ask you a few questions? Jerome nodded, though his heart was pounding. I don't know anything about a car being stolen. I've been inside with my kids all night. Officer Davis looked at him, his expression unreadable. We'll need to check the surveillance cameras in the area and ask around. For now, just stay calm. Jerome nodded, his hands clenched into fists by his side, trying to keep his cool. Malik and Tara, who had come outside to see what was happening, stood nervously behind him. They had never seen their father look so stressed, and it scared them. Linda, meanwhile, stormed back into her house, her heels clicking loudly against the pavement. She was sure Jerome had something to do with the theft. He didn't belong in this neighborhood, she thought bitterly. She had always felt that way, though she had never voiced it aloud. Hours passed, and the police investigation began. Neighbors whispered among themselves, some siding with Linda and others feeling uneasy about how quickly she had pointed fingers at Jerome without any evidence. The neighborhood, usually peaceful and welcoming, felt divided. As the sun began to set, Officer Davis returned to Linda's house. His face was grim, and he was holding a file in his hand. Linda opened the door, expecting to hear that her car had been found and that Jerome would soon be arrested. But the look on the officer's face told her otherwise. "Mrs. Hawkins," he began slowly, "we found your car." Linda's eyes widened in relief. "Where is it?" "Did that man?" Officer Davis interrupted her. "It wasn't stolen, ma'am. It was towed this morning. It was illegally parked on the street. You must have forgotten to move it into your driveway last night." Linda's heart sank as the realization hit her. Her car had been towed, not stolen. She had accused Jerome of something he hadn't done, and now the whole neighborhood knew. But Officer Davis wasn't finished. He glanced down at the file in his hand before looking back up at Linda. "There's something else you should know, Mrs. Hawkins. We discovered something while investigating. It's about Jerome Williams and his connection to your family." Linda's breath caught in her throat, confusion spreading across her face. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice quieter now, the arrogance replaced by unease. Officer Davis hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "It's about your husband and Jerome's past. I think you're going to want to sit down for this." Linda's world, so carefully constructed over the years, began to unravel in that moment. There was a secret buried deep in her past, one she had no idea existed. A secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, and the man she had just wrongfully accused. Linda stood frozen at her front door, her hand gripping the doorknob as Officer Davis's words echoed in her mind. Jerome's connection to your family. What could he possibly mean? Her mind raced, filled with a mix of confusion and dread. Reluctantly, she stepped aside and gestured for Officer Davis to enter. She felt a knot forming in her stomach as he made his way into her grand living room, a space decorated with expensive furniture and tasteful art that now felt suffocating. "Mrs. Hawkins, I need you to understand something before I continue," Officer Davis said, his tone gentle yet firm. "This isn't just about your car being towed. There's a history here you're not aware of, one that involves your late husband." Linda flinched at the mention of David Hawkins, her husband who had passed away unexpectedly 5 years earlier. He had been a successful businessman, a man respected by many, but he had always kept certain aspects of his life private, even from her. Now her heart pounded with unease. "What does my husband have to do with Jerome?" she demanded, her voice cracking despite her efforts to remain composed. "I don't understand. He never mentioned anyone by that name." Officer Davis sat down, placing the file carefully on the table in front of him. He looked at her, his face a blend of sympathy and resolve. "It's not surprising that David never spoke about this. From what we've gathered, it's something he would have wanted to keep buried." Linda sat down across from him, her hands trembling as she clasped them in her lap. She could feel the weight of the room pressing in on her, the air thick with secrets she didn't want to hear. "Jerome's mother, Sylvia Williams, worked for your husband many years ago," Officer Davis began, his voice steady but somber. "She was a housekeeper at one of his properties before you were married to him." Linda blinked, trying to process the information. She had never known about Sylvia or any housekeeper, for that matter. David had always been meticulous about separating his personal and professional life. Why hadn't he ever told her? "Your husband and Sylvia were involved in a relationship," Officer Davis continued, watching as Linda's face paled with each word. "It wasn't just a professional connection. It was deeper." Linda's heart raced as a cold sweat formed on her forehead. What are you saying?" she whispered, though she already feared the answer. "Sylvia was pregnant with Jerome at the time," Officer Davis said softly, the words hanging heavily in the air. David was Jerome's father. The room seemed to spin as Linda's world crumbled around her. She shook her head, unable to believe what she was hearing. "No, that can't be true," she muttered, her voice shaky. "David would have told me. He would never have hidden something like that." Officer Davis sighed. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Hawkins, but it appears that David made sure Sylvia and Jerome stayed far away from his life after you came into the picture. We found old letters and legal documents, settlements that ensured their silence. Jerome never knew the full story until recently, after his mother passed away. He's been trying to piece it together since then." Tears welled up in Linda's eyes, but she fought them back. How could David have done this? How could he have had a child with another woman and hidden it from her all these years? A betrayal she never saw coming, one that had been lurking in the shadows of her marriage. But beyond the personal devastation, guilt began to creep into her chest. She had accused Jerome of stealing her car, throwing out baseless accusations simply because of her own biases. And now she was learning that Jerome was her husband's son, her stepson. "I had no idea," Linda murmured, her voice barely audible. "I didn't know any of this." Officer Davis gave her a moment to process the revelation. He had seen this kind of devastation before, the destruction of carefully constructed lives when hidden truths were finally exposed. But this was different. This was more than just a family secret. It was an unraveling of a deeply ingrained prejudice that Linda hadn't even realized she held. As Linda sat there, tears streaming down her cheeks, she thought about all the times she had ignored Jerome, never taking the time to know him or his story. She had treated him like an outsider, never once imagining that they shared a connection through David. A connection she would never have chosen, but one that was undeniable. Finally, Officer Davis stood up, sensing that she needed time to herself. "I understand this is a lot to take in, Mrs. Hawkins," he said quietly, "but I suggest you speak with Jerome. I think there's a lot more to this story, and he deserves to know the truth, just like you." Linda nodded weakly, barely able to form words. She was trapped in a web of disbelief, shame, and regret, unsure of how she would ever face Jerome again after everything that had happened. As Officer Davis left, Linda sat alone in the silence of her home. Her once perfect world was crumbling before her eyes. But the hardest part had yet to come, facing Jerome and the consequences of her actions. Across the street, Jerome sat on his front porch, his mind racing. The events of the day had left him shaken. He had always felt out of place in this neighborhood, always sensed the unease from people like Linda, who looked at him as if he didn't belong. But now, with the truth about his father finally starting to surface, everything felt surreal. His mother had hinted at something before she passed, but she had never told him the full story. He had spent years trying to piece it together, only to find out that the man who had abandoned them was the same man who had built a life across the street with someone else. The weight of it all was too much to bear. Malik and Tara played quietly in the front yard, unaware of the storm brewing in their father's heart. Jerome watched them, feeling a mix of sadness and determination. He had always tried to give them the life he never had, a life of stability, love, and opportunity. But now, the shadows of his past were catching up to him, and he had no choice but to confront them. He couldn't run from the truth anymore. He needed to know why his father had abandoned him and why Linda had accused him so easily, so carelessly, as if he were nothing more than a thief. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Jerome made a decision. He would talk to Linda. He would demand answers, not just about his father, but about the life he was forced to live in the shadows, the life David had denied him. But what would he find when he crossed the street? And was he truly prepared for what Linda might say? The following morning, Jerome stood in front of Linda's house, his heart pounding in his chest. The bright, pristine home that had always seemed so distant and untouchable now felt like the epicenter of a truth he had been avoiding for far too long. He knew this conversation would change everything, but he couldn't walk away from it now. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet neighborhood. He could hear the soft shuffle of footsteps behind the door, and then it swung open. Linda stood there, her face pale and drawn, as if the weight of the world had settled on her shoulders overnight. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Two people connected by a man who had hidden a life between them, a man who had shaped their fates without their consent. "Jerome," Linda finally said, her voice shaky, barely holding together. I didn't expect you so soon. I didn't expect to be here either," Jerome replied, his voice tense. He glanced past her, into the house that should have been part of his life, the home he should have known. It felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down into an abyss. "But I think we both know this conversation is long overdue." Linda stepped aside, her hands trembling as she motioned for him to come in. The atmosphere inside the house was suffocating, filled with the ghosts of secrets and lies. Jerome's eyes swept over the expensive furniture, the perfectly curated decor, the life that had been denied to him and his mother. He followed her into the living room, his fists clenched as he tried to control the flood of emotions swirling inside him. Anger, sadness, betrayal. He had spent so many years wondering why his father had left him and his mother, why they had been forgotten while David built a new life. And now, here he was, in the middle of that life, ready to demand answers. Linda sat down on the couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes avoiding his. "I know you must hate me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "For everything I said, for how I treated you. I didn't know. I swear, I didn't know about you. If I had..." Jerome remained standing, his eyes hard, unyielding. "If you had known, what would have been different, Linda? Would you have welcomed me into your family? Would you have treated me like your own son?" His voice was low, sharp with bitterness. "Or would you have continued to see me the way you always have, as someone who doesn't belong?" Linda flinched, his words cutting through her fragile defenses. Tears welled up in her eyes as she looked up at him, her heart heavy with guilt. "You're right," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I was wrong. I was so wrong. I let my own prejudices blind me to who you really are. And for that, I'm sorry." Jerome stared at her, his chest tightening with a mix of emotions. He had spent years imagining what it would be like to confront the people who had hurt him, to demand accountability for the way he had been treated. But now, standing here, he realized that no apology, no matter how sincere, could erase the pain of the past. "I'm not here for your apology," Jerome said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm here because I need to know why. Why did my father leave us? Why did he choose you and your life over me and my mother?" Linda's tears spilled over as she shook her head. "I don't know," she whispered. "I wish I could give you the answers you're looking for, but I don't know. David, he never told me about you. He never told me about your mother. He kept that part of his life hidden, even from me. And now, I'm realizing that I didn't really know him at all." Jerome felt a wave of despair wash over him. The answers he had been searching for, the closure he had hoped to find, seemed further away than ever. He had come here, ready to confront the man who had abandoned him. But that man was gone, leaving nothing but shattered pieces of a life Jerome could never reclaim. "I used to think that if I could just talk to him, if I could just ask him why, everything would make sense," Jerome said, his voice trembling. "But he's not here. He's gone, and I'm left with nothing but questions. All I wanted was to understand why he didn't want me, why he chose to abandon me and my mom." Linda sobbed quietly, the weight of her guilt and shame pressing down on her. "I'm sorry, Jerome," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Jerome looked at her, his heart heavy with a pain he had carried for so long. Part of him wanted to lash out, to make her feel the depth of his hurt, but another part of him, one he hadn't realized existed, felt a strange sense of empathy. Linda, too, had been deceived. She, too, had been living in a lie, even if it was a different kind of lie. But even as that empathy flickered inside him, the anger remained. Anger at a father who had taken the easy way out, who had built walls between his two families rather than face the consequences of his actions. Jerome took a deep breath, steadying himself. "You didn't know," he said, his voice hollow. But you made assumptions. You looked at me and saw someone who didn't belong. You didn't give me a chance to be anything other than what you expected me to be. Linda nodded, wiping away her tears. I know, she said softly. I know, and I regret it more than you'll ever know. The room fell into a heavy silence, the weight of unspoken words pressing down on both of them. Jerome could feel the walls closing in, the years of pain and resentment threatening to overwhelm him. But he had come here for answers, and he wasn't going to leave without them. Did he ever mention Sylvia? Jerome asked, his voice tight. Did he ever say anything about her? Linda hesitated for a moment, then shook her head. No, she whispered. Not once. He kept that part of his life completely hidden. I never knew there was someone else. Jerome clenched his fists, the anger boiling inside him. His father had erased them, had wiped them from his life as if they had never existed. And now, there was no one left to hold accountable. But just as he was about to walk out, his mother's words echoed in his mind. Don't carry that hate, Jerome. It'll eat you alive. He paused, taking a deep breath. His mother had always been the stronger one, the one who had carried them both when David walked away. And she had always told him that hate would only weigh him down. Jerome turned back to Linda, his voice soft but firm. I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him, he said. But I won't let his choices define me. I've built a life for myself, a life that he had no part in, and I'm proud of that. Linda nodded, tears still streaming down her face. You should be, she whispered. You deserve so much more than what he gave you. Jerome stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of years of anger and pain begin to lift, just slightly. He knew the journey wasn't over, that the scars would remain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace. I hope you find the answers you're looking for, Jerome, Linda said, her voice filled with sorrow and regret. I'm sorry for everything. Jerome gave a small nod. Me too, he said quietly. As he walked out of Linda's house, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the quiet street. He knew that the pain of the past would never fully disappear, but he also knew that he had the strength to move forward. And somewhere, in the distance, he could almost hear his mother's voice, telling him that he was finally free. The wind had picked up as Jerome walked down the quiet suburban street, the cool air a welcome relief to the storm brewing inside him. His conversation with Linda had left him feeling raw, exposed, and, above all, uncertain. The anger he had carried for so long, the resentment towards his father, had begun to dissolve, but in its place was an emptiness, a void he wasn't sure how to fill. As he approached his car, Jerome stopped, staring at his reflection in the window. His face, lined with years of hardship and perseverance, stared back at him, but there was something different now. His eyes, which had once burned with a quiet fury, now reflected a man searching for peace. The realization unsettled him. How could he find peace in the middle of this storm? How could he forgive a man who had abandoned him, lied to him, erased his existence from his new life? His phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking his thoughts. It was his mother, Sylvia. He hadn't told her about his meeting with Linda yet, hadn't wanted to worry her. But now, with so many emotions churning inside him, he felt the need to hear her voice. Hey, Ma, he said, his voice sounding far more strained than he'd intended. Jerome, baby, are you all right? Sylvia's voice was warm and familiar, a balm to the turmoil in his chest. I'm okay, he replied, though the words felt like a lie. I went to see Linda today. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. He could almost hear his mother's heart breaking again, just as it had when David had walked out on them so many years ago. And how did that go? She asked, her voice carefully controlled, as though she were bracing for the impact of his response. Jerome sighed, leaning against his car. It was tough. She didn't know about us. At least she says she didn't. She seemed genuine, Ma. She apologized for everything, for the way she treated me. I think she feels guilty, but he trailed off, unsure of how to explain the complicated emotions swirling inside him. Sylvia's voice softened. "Baby, you don't owe anyone your forgiveness. Not her, not him. If you need time, that's okay. I thought I'd feel better, you know?" Jerome said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I thought I'd get some answers and it would all make sense. But it doesn't. It just feels empty." "That's because the pain doesn't go away overnight," Sylvia replied gently. "You've been carrying this hurt for a long time, Jerome. It's not going to disappear just because she said she's sorry. But maybe, in time, you'll find a way to let go of it." "I don't even know if I want to let it go," Jerome admitted, the words spilling out before he could stop them. "I feel like if I do, I'll be giving him a pass for everything he did. For leaving us, for never looking back." Sylvia was quiet for a moment, her breath audible over the line. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but firm. "Your father's choices were his, Jerome. They don't define you. You're not him. You don't have to carry his guilt anymore." Jerome felt his throat tighten, the weight of her words hitting him in a way he hadn't expected. For so long, he had believed that his father's abandonment had shaped his life, that the anger he held was what had driven him to succeed. But now, as he stood in the twilight of this quiet street, he realized that maybe, just maybe, his mother was right. Maybe he didn't have to carry that weight anymore. "I know you're right," Jerome whispered, his voice barely audible. "I just don't know how to let it go." "Start by letting yourself feel everything," Sylvia said. "The anger, the sadness, the grief. You've been trying to be so strong for so long. But it's okay to hurt, Jerome. It's okay to be sad." Jerome closed his eyes, tears slipping down his cheeks as he let her words sink in. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to truly feel the depth of his pain. The pain of a boy who had been left behind, the pain of a man who had never felt good enough, the pain of a son who had lost his father without ever having him to begin with. "I miss him, Ma," Jerome whispered, the confession ripping from his chest like a wound torn open. "I hate him, but I miss him." Sylvia's voice cracked with emotion as she replied, "I know, baby, I know." They stayed on the phone like that for a long time, neither saying much, but both understanding the unspoken weight of their shared loss. It wasn't just Jerome who had been abandoned, it had been both of them. And together they had built a life that David had never been a part of. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the street, Jerome finally said goodbye and hung up the phone. He felt lighter somehow, as if a small part of the weight he had carried for so long had begun to lift. But as he sat in his car, ready to leave Linda's pristine neighborhood behind, a thought struck him. There was one more person who could give him the answers he needed. One more person who had been there through it all, who had known David in a way that neither he nor Linda ever had. Jerome started the engine and headed towards the old neighborhood, the place where it had all begun. The streetlights flickered on as he drove through the familiar streets, his heart pounding with anticipation. He parked in front of a small, run-down house, the paint peeling from the walls, the windows dirty and cracked. It had been years since he had been here, but the memories came flooding back in an instant. The door creaked open as he knocked, and an elderly man stood before him, his eyes clouded with age but sharp with recognition. "Jerome?" the man asked, his voice gravelly with age. "What are you doing here, son?" "I need to talk, Mr. Willis," Jerome said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I need to know the truth, about my father, about why he left." Mr. Willis, his father's old friend and confidant, stepped aside, motioning for Jerome to come in. The house smelled of dust and old wood, the weight of time hanging heavily in the air. Jerome sat down in the worn-out armchair, his hands clenched in his lap as he waited for the man to speak. "You want to know why David left?" Mr. Willis said, settling into his own chair. "I suppose it's about time someone told you the truth." Jerome's heart raced as he leaned forward, his breath catching in his throat. He had come here searching for answers, but he wasn't sure he was ready for what he was about to hear. "Your father," Mr. Willis began, his voice low and steady, "wasn't the man you thought he was." Jerome's stomach churned as the old man's words hung in the air, the shadows of the past closing in around him. And in that moment, Jerome knew that the truth he had been searching for would change everything. The silence that followed Mr. Willis's words was suffocating. Jerome sat frozen in the worn-out chair, his hands gripping the armrests as though they were the only things tethering him to reality. His father wasn't the man he thought he was. The words rang in his ears, louder with every second that passed. "What do you mean?" Jerome finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. His heart pounded in his chest, fear and anticipation coursing through him. He had spent years building an image of his father in his mind, a cold, unfeeling man who had abandoned him and his mother. But the way Mr. Willis spoke suggested something deeper, something more complex. Mr. Willis leaned back in his chair, his face etched with lines of age and sorrow. He sighed heavily, as though the weight of the truth had been sitting on his chest for too long. "Your father, David, he left because he thought it was the only way to protect you and your mother." Jerome frowned, his mind struggling to process the words. "Protect us?" It didn't make sense. "Protect us from what?" he asked, his voice rising with confusion. "He abandoned us. He left without a word. How is that protection?" Mr. Willis's eyes, once sharp, now glistened with a mixture of regret and understanding. "It wasn't supposed to be that way. David never meant to leave for good. He got involved with some dangerous people, Jerome. People who were using him, threatening him. He was trying to shield you from the mess he found himself in." Jerome's breath caught in his throat as the words sank in. His father, his absent, uncaring father, had been caught up in something dangerous? It didn't excuse the abandonment, but it added layers to a story Jerome had never known existed. But why didn't he tell us? Why didn't he just talk to us? Jerome's voice cracked, the pain of his childhood resurfacing in waves. "We were his family. He left us to fend for ourselves." Mr. Willis looked down at his hands, his voice thick with emotion. "He thought if he stayed away, you'd be safe. He thought they wouldn't come after you if he wasn't in the picture." Jerome felt his stomach twist, a mix of anger and disbelief bubbling to the surface. "Who were they?" he demanded. "Who was after him?" Mr. Willis hesitated, as though he were weighing how much to reveal. "They were men tied to some very bad business, illegal stuff. Your father got in deep with them, thinking he could outsmart them, but it didn't work out that way. He became a target, and so did you." The room seemed to close in on Jerome as he processed the revelation. His father had been running from a danger Jerome had never even known existed. His entire life, he had believed David had left because he didn't care, but now it seemed that he had left because he cared too much. But that didn't take away the years of hurt, the years of feeling unwanted, unloved. Why didn't he come back? Jerome's voice was barely a whisper now, the pain in his chest growing heavier with each passing second. Why didn't he fix things? He could have come back. Mr. Willis shook his head slowly, regret etched deeply in his features. David tried, Jerome. After things settled down, he wanted to come back. But by then, things had changed. Your mother had moved on. She had built a life for you, and he didn't want to disrupt that. He didn't know how to come back after being gone for so long. Jerome's heart ached with a new kind of sadness, the kind that comes from knowing that something irreparable had been broken. His father had stayed away, not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to face the wreckage of the life he had left behind. "I needed him," Jerome whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "I needed him to be there, and he wasn't." Mr. Willis's voice softened, and for a moment, he seemed lost in his own memories. "I know, Jerome, and I know it doesn't make it better, but your father wasn't a bad man. He was just lost." The weight of Mr. Willis's words settled over Jerome like a heavy blanket. He had spent his whole life hating his father for leaving, and now, faced with the truth, he didn't know how to feel. The anger was still there, but it was mixed with sorrow, regret, and a deep sense of loss. For the father he could have had, for the life that could have been different. "What am I supposed to do now?" Jerome asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "How do I live with this?" Mr. Willis leaned forward, his gaze steady and kind. You forgive him, Jerome, not because he deserves it, but because you deserve peace. The words hit Jerome like a punch to the gut. Forgive? How could he forgive a man who had caused so much pain? But as the seconds passed, he realized that Mr. Willis was right. Forgiveness wasn't about David. It was about freeing himself from the anger, the hurt, the resentment that had weighed him down for so many years. Jerome stood up slowly, his legs shaky but resolute. He knew what he had to do, even if it felt impossible. He needed to find peace for himself, for his mother, for the life that had been stolen from him. "Thank you," Jerome said quietly, meeting Mr. Willis's gaze. "Thank you for telling me the truth." Mr. Willis nodded, his eyes heavy with understanding. "I hope you can find the peace you're looking for, Jerome. Your father, he wanted that for you, more than anything." Jerome left the house, the cool night air hitting his face as he walked to his car. He felt lighter somehow, as though the truth had freed him from the prison of his own anger. It didn't erase the pain, but it gave him a path forward, a path that led to healing. As he drove home, Jerome made a silent promise to himself. He would visit his father's grave, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to let go of the past. He would stand there, in the quiet of the cemetery, and say the words he had never been able to say, "I forgive you." And in that moment, Jerome knew that forgiveness wasn't about absolution. It was about reclaiming his own life, about freeing himself from the chains of his father's mistakes. For the first time in years, Jerome felt the stirrings of peace deep in his chest. He wasn't there yet, but he was on the way. And as he drove through the quiet streets, the lights of the city glowing in the distance, he knew that he was finally ready to let go.